Good morning, counselors. For the record, my name is Jenna Kay with Community Planning. I am joined today by Community Planning Director Oliver Orgiaco and Steve Faust of 3J Consulting. And we are here to provide you with an update on the Housing Option Study and Action Plan project. Next slide. Steve and I are going to tag team during the presentation today. Our plan is to provide a project overview, review Housing Action Plan objectives and strategies considered so far, provide an update on public involvement, and then end with time for questions. We listed a few questions here as something to think about as we go through the presentation slides. By the end of the work session, we would be interested to hear if you have any feedback on any of the strategy ideas so far, if you have any questions about the advisory group's direction or process, and if there's anything you would like to recommend regarding the next public engagement activities. Next slide. As you may recall, we have met with you a couple of times so far on this project. We were last before you in April to give you a project update. And since then, the project advisory group has primarily been reviewing and discussing possible strategy ideas. And they're about to work on development of a draft set of recommendations. So we're providing another update now before they move to that next step to draft those recommendations. Next slide. As a reminder for anyone who may be watching or listening in, the purpose of the Housing Option Study and Action Plan is to understand our local housing challenges and identify strategies to encourage additional housing types that are affordable to households with a variety of income levels in the unincorporated Vancouver urban growth area. And this may be done through the removal of regulatory barriers and or other possible strategies. The county is focusing on the unincorporated Vancouver urban growth area for this project because it is similar to a city. It's in an area in the county's jurisdiction with urban services that can support an urban level of development and support housing types such as duplexes, triplexes, townhouses, condominiums, and multifamily apartments. Next slide. So far, the Housing Option Study project has included stakeholder interviews and focus groups to help identify major housing barriers and opportunities, a housing inventory and data analysis report, and an audit of land use policies, zoning, and regulations. Our consultant team has also conducted feasibility pro forma analyses on a couple types of housing and provided case studies on a few other jurisdictions doing similar housing initiatives. As I mentioned, right now we're in the phase of work on strategy development. And Steve is going to next walk you all through the process that the advisory group has taken on this work so far. Next slide.
Thank you, Jenna, and thank you, counselors, for your time today. Since we last met, our project advisory group took a look at the information that Jenna mentioned on the last slide, our interviews to understand the issues, housing and demographic data in the study area, and review of current regulations to develop draft housing action plan objectives. Next slide, please. They came up with 5 objectives that we then will use to help determine the efficacy of the different strategies that we're going to be looking at and whether or not they meet these objectives. So the first has to do with encouraging housing that meets the need of middle income households not currently served in the market. The second strategy focuses more on low, very low, and extremely low income households. The third looks at a diversity in housing types and tenure, so whether it's rental or ownership, middle housing or multifamily. The fourth has to do with creating housing or encouraging housing for a broad range of household sizes, or housing to meet the needs of household sizes. And while we certainly want to meet the needs of all household sizes, we did note in the presentation we gave you last time in the data that there's a particular lack of housing to meet the needs of 1 to 2 person households, which is a significant portion of the population. And then the final objective is trying to encourage housing options in areas with access to transportation, transit, commercial services, schools and parks and other amenities, and conversely, supporting the development of those same types of amenities in areas where housing exists. Next slide, please. And the next slide. Great. So since we saw you last in June through August, the project advisory group has met 3 times, really going through, as Jenna mentioned, the entire universe or a very large universe of possible strategies, and discuss them. And we are now in a period here in September where we have met with Planning Commission, we met with the DEAB, we're giving a presentation to you today, and we're working to refine the strategies based on those discussions. And so the goal of this project is to have strategies that are implementable come out of this project. So that'll be one category of strategies. A second will be strategies we think will be highly effective and but might take a little more time to implement. And then a third would be the lesser that prioritized, I should say, strategies. So we will in the PAG in October and December and take this list of prioritized strategies and turn them into a recommendation that we will then bring back to you and the public. And then in January of next year, we'll move into preparing the final action plan and the legislative process for adoption. Next slide, please. So in order to look at or develop our strategies, we started with a list from the Washington Department of Commerce. You can see the categories listed here. We then took those categories, modified them a bit, and started developing specific strategies that we think are appropriate for our study area of Clark County. Next slide, please. For each strategy, we evaluated them based on the timeline that we think it'll take to implement them, potential costs, administrative effort, and then we have a space for evaluating their potential impact. We held off on filling out that information till after we had the conversation with our advisory group, and so we can take their wisdom and comments and incorporate them in there. So we'll be doing that in this next phase of developing a list of prioritized strategies. Next slide, please. This is just an example of a table that we developed for each, for different strategies and how we identify where they fall according to those different criteria and the objectives I presented earlier. Next slide, please. So I showed you earlier the list of categories A through G. I'm just going to walk through these quickly to give you an idea of the types of strategies in each category, but I won't go into each in detail at this time. We'll do that the next time we get together. So category A was really focuses on expanding the overall supply of housing and introducing new types of housing opportunities, and that included strategies such as reducing minimum lot sizes and in existing zones, increasing allowed housing types. Next slide, please. For category B, we looked more at modifying existing regulatory tools such as parking requirements or setbacks or design standards that can affect the feasibility of development projects. So we looked at revising ground floor commercial requirements for mixed-use development. We looked at manufactured home and tiny home communities as another potential avenue. Next slide, please. And category C focused on process improvements, things like permitting process streamlining, environmental review, other things to just reduce the overhead costs for development that might help with feasibility. Next slide, please. Category D focused more on strategies for affordable housing. We looked at multifamily tax exemption, fee waivers for affordable housing, and other similar strategies. Next slide, please. Category E looked at funding options. That included taking another look at federal and state funding and how it's being filtered through the county, as well as possibilities for local option taxes, fees, and levies, and continuing and enhancing partnerships with local housing providers. Next slide, please. We had an other strategies category that just didn't fit into one of the other categories neatly. Things like legislative advocacy for legislation changes, which I think you're doing, have been doing some of that in some areas. Accessibility for people with disabilities, motel and hotel conversions are some of the examples there. And then category G. This category has to do with preventing displacement and preserving affordable housing. So it looked at things like tenant and homeowner protections and assistance, and again, looking at manufactured home and tiny home communities and other similar strategies. So that's the giving you an overview of the types of strategies that our project advisory group has been looking at over the summer. And we look forward to coming back to you with a prioritized list of more specific strategies for you to look at. In terms of public involvement activities, next slide, please. Here we are still in this phase 3 of developing recommendations, which we've been doing over the summer. We've already conducted our first of what we're thinking of as 3 rounds of public community engagement. And next slide, please. Some of the activities that we've conducted to date. This list here is everything identified in the public participation plan. The highlighted ones are ones that we have already used to engage the public. And for our next round of community engagement coming up in the November timeframe, we will be definitely holding some sort of virtual or other, maybe an in-person, who knows, workshop. And we also are going to make efforts to reach out to specific interest groups that we want to make sure weigh in on the list of prioritized strategies. Next slide, please. And that brings us to questions for council. Certainly not limited to these questions. Happy to answer any questions you have about our process to date and what we have coming up in the coming months. Thank you.
Thanks. Are there questions from the council?
I have just a quick one, Madam Chair.
Councilman.
So thank you very much. The broad scope of what you're looking at is fantastic. A couple of points that have come up to me from constituents over the last few months pointed to, are we looking at height restrictions? You know, there are some locations in the county, certainly within the cities, where going up for apartment style living or multifamily is something to look at. And I mean, there no doubt are some city angst at going too high, but I'm wondering what those restrictions are in height around the county and whether there are appropriate locations where we could adjust that. You know, most of the apartments I've heard about that have gone up around the riverfront or even in Washougal for that matter aren't affordable. You know, they're high end. And then those that qualify for tax breaks are using really a Portland balanced metric as to what's affordable versus a Vancouver, Clark County, what's affordable. And so I know that's a challenge as well. So I'm just curious if we are looking at height restrictions and multifamily zoning as to where they may fit within the county to get our housing costs down, especially on the lower end.
Yes, Commissioner. I'll start, Jenna, and then if you want to jump in. We are certainly looking at height along with other regulations. You know, like we said earlier, setbacks and lot sizes, all sorts of strategies related to current regulations. I think, as you stated, the trick is how do we tailor those strategies to meet our objectives, to hit the price points that we're looking for in terms of, if you remember our objectives, we had one for middle income households and another for low and very low income households. So I think that's the trick, is tailoring those strategies to meet those objectives.
Yeah, and I don't think I would add too much more. I know in regards to things like the multifamily tax exemption, we know the county's not currently eligible under state law for something like that. So that's an example of something that's in like our legislative advocacy bucket, you know, because it's something we know you all have advocated for in the past, but isn't something within our control or ability to use right now.
I have a couple of questions.
Councilor Brown.
The first one deals with the diversity of housing types that you've mentioned, and you sliced it and diced it in several ways, and that's all good. I didn't see anything on the urban-rural dichotomy, where many of our residents are really interested in maintaining rural options. Is that anything you are going to focus on or have focused on?
I can start with this one, and then Oliver, feel free to jump in if you want to add to that. So this project was scoped just to focus on the urban area in alignment with sort of Growth Management Act and state guidance in terms of where they're promoting where we add more housing. So we have certainly heard concerns from rural community members who are interested in providing additional housing options in the rural area, but that is not scoped as part of this project. Oliver, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think you covered it well, Jenna. The county really manages or has land use jurisdiction in the unincorporated area of Vancouver, and that is where the majority of the housing type issues or options are really focused on in terms of multifamily, duplex, triplex, and so forth. Those type of housing type, generally speaking, are not permitted in the rural area. And the first time we started this process, the first thing we did was to look at our current development regulations. And I think some of the councillors will remember we started with updating our accessory dwelling unit. And in doing so, we also included the rural area. Our attempt to make that detached was not permitted per the GMA law. So we made it attached, and that's the first time we extended the provision of accessory dwelling unit to the rural area. So there are very limited housing type that could be built in the rural area, for example. And this is all related to size and the lack of services and also GMA. There are areas where the council and legislative delegates can help us in looking at where changes can be made to the GMA, particularly in the what is called limited area of more intensive development, and that is our rural centers. What type of additional, broadly speaking, uses can be allowed in those areas where mixed use, multi-family, or different type of job opportunities can be provided in our rural centers, for example. That I know that the Washington Association of Counties is really pushing the legislature to open up opportunities for those limited area of more intensive development. So those are areas where we have options. If provided by the legislature, we some relief can be provided as it relates to how we look at the rural area. That would be my response, Councillor.
So, so that I understand, does your work involve any focus at all on what are now rural areas for conversion to higher density?
No.
No. Okay, great. And then I did have a second question. When we were looking at your strategies, I thought I read that one of them was to remove density limits. And I probably am misunderstanding. You don't mean just the sky's the limit and anything goes, I'm sure. What does that phrase mean?
Steve, do you want to
Steve,
start, or would you like
Steve,
me
can you
to?
take on this? I'm not sure where this is.
Sure. And again, this list originated with the Washington Department of Commerce, and it was a starting place for us to discuss strategies. But different zone designations within the area do have density limits, and one of the strategies is looking at modifying, or in some cases removing those. That is an option that other jurisdictions have pursued. But again, it was part of a large list of strategies, and not necessarily one that's going to make it onto our prioritized list.
Would you please not?
Thank you.
That would be helpful.
Thank you.
Could I ask that this screen, you change it to the strategies or the thing that the Department of Commerce is suggesting or allowing? And I have a question about this. One of the things was the zoning, upzoning and this sort of thing. And then my natural question came from that. Does this mean in the rural community? I guess we had an answer to that. Is this only in the urban growth boundary? And why? I mean, maybe you're just saying that's just your purview and you can't do anything else. But to me, that does not answer our problem with housing if you're not going to do that. So is that upzoning only within the urban growth boundary, or reduce minimum lot sizes, require minimum density, all of these things?
Yes, it is just focused within the urban growth boundary. I think for something such as the upzoning idea, we were discussing the idea of, you could change zoning of things already within the urban growth boundary. You also could make a plan for as area comes in to the urban growth boundary in the future, perhaps that land may be, zoned. So it's still we're still looking within the urban growth boundary, but thinking about, that it may expand at some point in the future as well.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? And I guess just I want to follow up. Have you had some of the public input and meetings, etc., or is that coming?
We had a first round of public meetings around the last time we met with you to talk about the results of the studies we did. We had planned to do another round of public involvement at this period of time, but we thought that it would be more useful for us to put together the list of prioritized strategies and bring that to the public rather than giving them this information, because there's just not as much for them to respond to at this time. So that's the plan, is to get that list of priorities together and then go out to the public for the next round of engagement.
Okay, that sounds good.
Madam Chair,
Councilor
I don't know if this is in light of what was just said or not, but I just want to give you my thoughts on it, because this really was the first time that I understood that this effort was just primarily focused on the urban growth boundary. And I'm thinking of, the one slide where you said short-term, mid-term, long-term goals. I see planning for the entire county is really a strategic long-term goal. You know, we have rural centers, we have some towns that are really just lacking infrastructure. And so I would hate to not just focus on the urban growth boundary, because I think we're missing this strategic view of how we get to housing development throughout the county. And it also leaves the rural county behind in a certain aspect where they're not going to see any proposed density change or mixed use. And then it kind of shortchanges us on, well, how do we prioritize the infrastructure that we need out in the rural county if we don't expect additional density in some of these locations? So I really would like to see a broader view beyond the urban growth boundary, even if it is just for long-term planning purposes, as it would inform us on comp development plans and infrastructure priorities. I think we should not leave the rural areas behind and leave them out of this discussion.
I'd just like to second what you just said, Counselor. That's my perspective as well. I think really the reason for my question on that as well.
Mine as well. Thank you. Well said, Councilor Medved. It doesn't, yeah. They're left out far too much, and people do live in the rural community. Unfortunately, not as many as would like to, because of our urban growth. I mean, our Growth Management Act, or so we're told. Any other questions? Okay. Does this conclude your presentation? Or do you have more?
I just wanted to confirm our next step with all of you. So our plan is, once the advisory group has a draft set of recommendations, we would like to send them to you all to review by email. And then we would check in with you to see if you would be interested in one-on-ones or another work session at that time. So that would be sometime this fall.
Okay, thank you. We will appreciate that and look forward to it. We may want to have another similar session to this, unless we do them one-on-ones, etc. But we do thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, I